Good morning, and you're very welcome to today's CBI at 10 webinar. My name is Kerry Thomas from a company called Tortoise Media. Great pleasure to be doing these events in conjunction with the CBI, particularly at a moment like today when it just feels so vital to try and figure out what on earth is going on in the world. I'm sure we're all in the same boat in being in equal measure fixated and horrified by what's happening in Ukraine, appalled by the human suffering that we can see, and at the same time, of course, trying to figure out what the wider consequences of this war are going to be. There's been a lot of talk about an energy price shock, something like the one we had in 1973, and I'm sure we'll touch on that. But Russia and Ukraine aren't only about oil and gas. Ukraine is hugely significant for food production, and Russia is a big player in a host of commodities. So we've seen huge disruption in things like the nickel market over the last couple of weeks. So this morning, I think we're going to try to assess the effect of the war in Ukraine on commodities in general, what that might mean for the global economy, what it might mean for supply chains, for the British economy and for business in this country. These things always go best when we hear as much as we can from you. So please do send in your questions, put them in the chat. We'll bring as many of them in as we can. If for any reason you want to submit your question anonymously, I always struggle with that, then just write anon at the top of it and we'll make sure that we deal with it in confidence. I think it does two things. It helps this conversation, but it also helps the CBI to know what's going on so that that can be fed through to those important conversations with government that go on all the time. So please chip in. But without further ado, let me just introduce the great panel we've got with us today. We've got Rain Newton-Smith, Chief Economist at the CBI, and Rain, I'll come to you in a second. And then a couple of real commodity specialists. We've got Caroline Bain, Chief Commodities Economist at Capital Economics. And we've got Mark Wilson, who's Health, Safety and Environment Director at Offshore Energies UK. And great pleasure to have you both. Looking forward to hearing from you shortly. But Rain, let's start with you. Let's start with a very big picture. Let's sort of paint the backdrop here. What are you hearing from government and business? What's the sort of big picture as regards business in the UK in the light of what's happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, look, I just think it's been a pretty devastating few weeks for everyone, and businesses have absolutely been, watching the devastation in Ukraine with horror. And I think what they've been focused on is first and foremost if they have any supporting staff in the Ukraine and Russia. That's absolutely been first and foremost. And of course, businesses here in the UK, with many of whom may have family in the Ukraine, and certainly at the CBI we had a very moving all staff where some of our own staff spoke about what they are going through. So then secondly, it's absolutely around supporting humanitarian efforts. We've been helping to coordinate that alongside the Ukrainian ambassador, and you can find on our website more details on how you can get involved, how you can help. Of course, in the immediate, it really is about funding to the big humanitarian aid agencies, the British Red Cross, the DEC, but where there's been specific offers of help or of need from the Ukrainian side, we've been helping to coordinate that, and it's been really heartening as well to see how businesses have been stepping up with that cause. And it's further down the line. I think there's also a real willingness to help as well with refugees and settling them here in the UK, but also thinking around employment opportunities and how we can help to integrate refugees into UK society as and when that's possible. Third, it's really obviously been about implementing sanctions as effectively as possible, and there we've been trying to be a port of call, directing businesses to where they can get more information on how the sanctions work, what it means for their businesses. And of course, businesses themselves have every business has been reviewing their operations in Russia and making some difficult decisions. I think anyone who thinks those decisions are easy, it's a lot more complicated. We have businesses who are supplying medicines to ordinary citizens in Russia, and obviously there's also a duty of care for staff in Russia, and making sure that they aren't vulnerable as a company withdraws operations. So I think there's been some really difficult decisions that businesses have been making. But I think what's clear and what we do know is, the arsenal that the West and what the UK is using is the economy is around economic sanctions, and I think businesses are absolutely prepared to play their part in that. But then, of course, the final piece is then thinking about what does it mean for the UK economy? What does it mean for businesses operating here? And I think what we can immediately see, and I know we'll go on to discuss this, is about energy prices. It's having a huge impact on energy and commodity prices. And one of the things that's coming through from businesses is just, we know we're a globally interlinked economy, but the Ukraine and Russia, hugely important to food production, particularly wheat, about 25% of the global market, and also, some specialist commodities around sunflower oil, a role within fertilizers. So likely to have an impact on food production, as well as processes like chemical production. So I think those supply chain linkages will become more apparent in the coming weeks. But I think finally there's this macro piece about what does it mean for individual households in the UK. We're going to see higher inflation. Inflation is likely to peak well above 8% now in the UK. We were already facing a challenge in a squeeze on living standards, particularly for low-income households, and it's much harder for them to, energy cost is a bigger proportion of their overall household budget, and it isn't something you can substitute away. And of course, food is an essential item. So it does mean the Chancellor needs to think very much about how he supports low-income households through some of those higher costs, but of course also for businesses. There are many SMEs in energy intensive industries who are going to face a lot more pressure on their cash flow. So thinking how we use the current COVID loan schemes and extend that at least till the end of the year to help some of the SMEs through what we know is going to be a challenging time. But I suppose at the end of the day, it really puts this emphasis on growth and productivity over the long term. How do we build business confidence? How do we get businesses investing even in this really tough climate? And I think that's why we need to see the Chancellor take some action around investment allowances, but also doubling down on green markets. And now is the time to accelerate actually our move towards a low carbon economy, towards more renewable forms of energy, rather than retreat. And that's a clear message that's come across from our members and through our regional council.
Okay, well, Rain, I think you've partly answered this already, but I imagine that the frantic work that must be going inside the Treasury ahead of the Chancellor's spring statement next week. But is the CBI's input to that to try and focus on the longer term rather than immediate sort of mitigation?
I think again, it absolutely has to be around those sort of bifocal lenses. I mean, we think, and our spring statement submission, which we put across to the Treasury a few weeks ago, I think still absolutely stands. It talked about in the long term, building on what the Chancellor set out at his May's lecture, which he unfortunately had to launch the day of the invasion. But but I think what he wanted to focus on there was on the long term. We need to focus on people, capital, and ideas, and that is what will drive our long term growth and productivity. So, we still think we need to see the Chancellor make, the time is now to set out what will happen when the super deduction comes to an end in 2023, because if you want businesses to invest in a time of high uncertainty, they need to have the assurance that the Chancellor is looking to the long term. But I think it does make the emphasis on some of the short-term measures we needed to see, support for the energy intensive industries, particularly SMEs who are dealing with a higher cost, more to the fore. And I think addressing the cost of living pressures have suddenly got more challenging, and therefore the Chancellor will need to act on that. And I think again, the policy decisions have definitely got harder, but to our mind, now is a time to be bold. It's not a time to be cautious. I think we do need to get ahead of some of the economic pressures we're going to see in our economy, and the Chancellor does need to take some clear action next week.
Yeah, and Rain, just before I come to Mark and Caroline, I think one of the themes of the conversation this morning is going to be that there's a lot we don't know, but we do know that the world has changed already. That something, and in that very broad sense, Rain, what's your assessment of the changes that you feel are baked in as a result of what's happened already?
Well, I think it's a few things. It really shines a light on our broader economic resilience and thinking about that over the long term. I think it has exacerbated and shone a light on issues we knew that were there. You know, the way our energy markets are regulated here in the UK. You know, we need to change that. We need to be more forward-looking. We need to have more of the investment in energy storage as well as new forms of renewable energy. So I think it definitely shines a light on that. Secondly, it really makes the pressures that we were seeing in the economy and us all getting used to a world of higher inflation. You know, it's making that much more acute than it was before. But I think finally it definitely shines a light on, you know, we live in a global world and we need to have, you know, we need to work together to address some of the global problems we face, and we need to think about, you know, our long-term, not just energy security, but also supplies and supply chains. If we think about electric vehicles, a lot of the components from that, you know, aren't produced in the UK. We need to think about where we secure those supplies and making sure that those have the right standards of governance. So I think some of those longer-term things that we knew were issues, but we haven't really addressed. You can call it, you know, we've talked about industrial strategy, but I think this really needs to be set in an international context as well. And I think that's where there's a lot of thought going into. And that's something, you know, obviously we at the CBI are keen to work with the government on. That will only work with businesses and government working alongside to address and make our economy as resilient as possible.
Okay, thanks so much, Rain. I'll come back to you very shortly, I'm sure. Caroline and Mark, let's bring you in. If I can start with you, Caroline, I'm just keen to know effectively what we've seen so far in terms of commodity price shocks. And because we're going to come to Mark in a second, who's going to, I think, talk particularly about oil and gas, maybe you could leave those two out of the equation and just talk to us about the rest of what we've seen as far as commodity pricing is concerned.
Certainly, yes. Hello. Well, we've just seen a general rise in commodity prices, really, for two reasons. Obviously, the commodities that are produced by Russia, there's now a huge risk about supply to the rest of the world of those commodities, and their prices have soared. But at the same time, there's been a general move up in commodity prices, and I think that reflects the fact that energy prices are high and been rising, and most commodity production is quite energy intensive, so metal fabrication or agriculture, they both use a lot of energy, so production costs have really risen. So I think there's two sort of factors driving prices higher over the last few months.
And Caroline, you know, I've just, you know, for the first time in my life paid attention to the nickel market because it got, so I saw it go up, but have we started to see prices come down after an initial spike, or are things starting to settle in any way?
Well, the nickel market is quite a unique story, really. There was speculative activity which sent prices way higher than fundamentals or even risk premium would justify. The market actually closed for a few days and has only reopened this morning, and is actually down quite sharply this morning. I think the way I think about what happened in the nickel market is that it's an example of the sort of volatility that we're seeing at the moment, that investors are very uncertain. There's huge uncertainty about supply of many commodities over the next year. And I think that's being reflected in these sort of extreme moves in prices. Okay.
And I guess, Caroline, again, just to pick up on the point Rain was talking about, is your assumption that what we've seen, the effects we've seen from the invasion of Ukraine, have already marked a structural change that we'll have to take account of in years to come, or could this be transitory?
And you asked me not to speak about energy, but I think on the energy front, it's certainly been the wake-up call that Europe and the UK needed in terms of reliance on what is quite an unreliable source of supply. And I think it's always been there in the background. Europe has been aware of it, but they've been forced now to deal with it. And even if we have a ceasefire, which would be wonderful very shortly, and peace, I think there will be an ongoing move away from a reliance on Russian energy. So certainly in the West. So I think yes, to answer your question, I think there is a bit of a structural change. I think it will accelerate the transition to green energy, but as I'm sure Mark's going to say as well, it's also shown that we're still reliant on oil and gas in the near term.
Okay. The final one to you, Caroline, before I come to Mark, because again, Rain mentioned it. Wheat is a problem that people have begun to pay more attention to because of the size of Ukrainian agricultural production. What's happened in wheat prices, and how severe a problem do you think that could be for global food production?
Well, as we've already highlighted, Russia and Ukraine account for about a third of the world's exports of wheat, so they're massive suppliers, particularly to the Middle East and North Africa. They get the majority of their grains from Russia and Ukraine. I mean, we only have to look back to the time of the Arab Spring and rising bread prices, and it could have political implications for those countries. It certainly has fiscal implications because they subsidize wheat. And in terms of the impact on Europe, the UK, obviously we're quite self-sufficient in wheat, but it won't stop the wheat price going up, and we'll still be paying that high price. It's more than doubled in the last couple of months. So it'll be feeding through into the inflation problem that we've already got.
Yeah. Okay. Caroline, thank you. Come back to you very shortly. Mark, thanks for your patience. Can I effectively ask you the same question as I asked Caroline first of all? Just walk us through what we've seen so far in global energy since the invasion.
So from a global energy perspective, we've obviously seen a lot of discussion around sort of supply and demand, and really a recognition of the level of supply across the nations from Russia, and a number of nations really now seeking sort of their self-sufficiency, their own independence of their supply. So certainly from a UK perspective, we've been looking at a short-term aspect of how do we increase production across from an oil and gas perspective, and in region of sort of new wells, further field development. We are seeing a decline in sort of oil and gas production in the UK of 7%, so we want to be able to look at increasing that, but balancing that with a medium-term and long-term aspiration of renewables, and recognizing that oil and gas and renewables require to be taken in a balanced approach to fulfill the full energy mix. And that's where we're seeing the focus, not just in the UK, but conversations around Europe about how we generate self-sufficiency from an oil and gas and from a renewable perspective. We're not heavily dependent on Russian imports, but we do have some reliance on LNG, and 10% of the oil and products such as diesels come from Russia. So from our perspective, it's a matter of sort of accelerating the investment from that 3 to 5 years in the renewables. When I say renewables, we're talking here about hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, electrification and offshore floating wind, so that we can sort of reduce that GHG emission footprint. We've got the North Sea transition deal that we've signed up for, and we're moving forward with that. We're not sort of removing ourselves from that North Sea transition deal, and very much focused on net zero, but recognizing, as I say, this energy balance between oil and gas and the renewable aspect. We simply cannot turn oil and gas off overnight. We need that there, and by generating more renewables, that commodity becomes ours within the UK, and we build less reliance on sort of the other areas in terms of sort of oil and gas imports.
Yeah, and Mark, just remind us what happened again to energy prices since the invasion. So we saw a very sharp spike initially. Again, have we seen some settling since then?
Yeah, so we saw the spike up to in the region of sort of $137, $139, very quick peak up to there, and now seeing it come down to in the region of $99, $100 at this moment in time. And that's in the wide recognition, I guess, that supply, the demand has stabilized to an element, but of course it's a volatile and sort of uncertain situation we find ourselves, and therefore that commodity clearly can go up and down. Hence the reason we want to generate stability, want to generate our own independent approach to this. We require investment to do that. When I talk about renewables, it's the industry requires 16 billion in investment. We also need the focus on skills, the people in relation to not just support oil and gas, but also to look at the renewable sector as well and building the resilience in there, all brought to light, of course, with the situation, the sort of horrific situation we find ourselves in with Ukraine, and looking at both material shortages that are emerging and indeed may emerge in the future, but also from the people aspect as well. And we're very proud. We've got a world-class supply chain. We, from a full-time equivalent, we have, from an oil and gas perspective, 195,000 individuals working on behalf of the oil and gas sort of offshore industry. And we want to be able to sustain that and move that even further into the renewable aspects, as I say, from that medium to long term. But we've got to generate investor confidence. That has dipped, and we need to make sure that we do have that investor confidence so we can move into the area of renewables and keep moving forward with that transition as we manage the decline of production that we're seeing.
Yeah, and Mark, how much does the change in price, how much does the rise in the price of oil and gas change your calculations about the viability of parts of the North Sea, for example? Does it bring back into play things that were previously off the books?
I wouldn't say necessarily the change in oil and gas price. I think what it's around is about fiscal stability. It's about investor confidence to come in and make those investments from a longer term perspective. We know that investors think long term, and they need that longer term sort of fiscal predictability and competitiveness. So it really has been able to generate and sort of seek that fiscal predictability to have those investments that we seek as we move, say, into that renewable aspects. We clearly want to unlock some of the shorter term investment in relation to oil and gas, to say wells development, field development, but then get that fiscal stability, get that investor confidence so that we can move forward and transition, as I say, moving forward on that journey towards net zero out to 2050 from the UK perspective, 2045 from Scotland.
Yeah, Caroline, let me come back to you, because I think you're probably doing a more sort of condensed version of what a lot of us are doing, which is just trying to figure out how we make sense of what's going on by looking back over things that have happened before and trying to say, is it a bit like 1973? Is it a bit like, whatever other date in the calendar you could pick? When you try to do that, as I'm sure you must be doing as an economist, where are you looking and what lessons are you learning from events that may not be identical, certainly won't be identical to this, but may have some lessons to teach us?
So I was saying in our pre-webinar chat, I'm really tired of using the word unprecedented at the moment, because as you say, typically we like to look back and look at previous instances of and draw some conclusions about what we can expect over the next year or so. But the closest parallel, I suppose, that we found has been the oil price shocks in the 1970s. But the world is obviously quite a different place now. We've also considered whether the run up to the financial crisis and soaring commodity prices then, we can draw some parallels, but that was a demand-driven shock in a way, as China emerged and greatly increased its consumption of commodities, which is nothing like the state of the global economy, given that we're just struggling to come out of a pandemic. We already had quite severe supply chains across many commodities and manufacturing supply chains. So it's a very different starting point. It's a much worse starting point, actually, in terms of inflation. I think the one parallel that we have decided is that with the oil price shocks in the 1970s, oil prices stayed high after the shocks. In most instances of geopolitical risk, oil prices fall back quite quickly, as if the geopolitical risk fades or stocks are drawn down. But in the 1970s, we had persistently, it was a new level of oil prices essentially. And that, I think, for not so much perhaps me looking at commodity prices, but more economists looking at inflation, I think that is quite a, we can draw some parallels from there.
Okay, so does that mean, Caroline, that the consensus among economists in your field particularly is that prices generally, not just energy, are likely to stay high for some time? This won't be a short, sharp shock?
Well, that's certainly our feeling. I think, as I mentioned, that I think there is a structural change going to happen within the energy markets. A reduction of Western reliance on Russia, and that will be quite costly. The supply is quite constrained in both oil and natural gas markets. So I think we will be in competition, and that will keep prices elevated for a while yet. And as I said before, that tends to push up the production costs of almost all other commodities, as well as manufactured goods, of course.
Yeah. Okay, Karen, thank you. Rain, let me come back to you, because I'm intrigued to try and think through I think one of the features of this particular crisis is that it comes hot on the heels of another one. That the pandemic brought us a set of supply problems, set of demand problems, and here we are now again with a huge supply shock. If you think about this in terms of supply chains, do the lessons that we've learned through the pandemic and the sort of disruption of those supply chains, then our efforts to rebuild them, have they put us in a better position to cope, or are we bruised and battered and here's another thing, do you think?
I think it's a bit of a combination of both. I mean, I think in terms of how businesses respond to crises, I think people are sort of battle hardened and battle ready. So obviously that's sort of a terrible phrase, I think, to be using when we're seeing a war on Europe's borders. But I think there is something about that agility and using also, I think, digital technologies to manage some of those supply chains. I think we have learned through COVID. I think where it's more challenging is obviously those businesses, and what we're thinking about and trying to look at is, which businesses have yet to fully recover from the impact from COVID, and which businesses are likely to be most hit by what's happening to energy prices and the supply chain shortages we're likely to see as a result in price inflation in supply chains from this crisis. And I think one area that does stem to light is that's in our minds is thinking about aviation. Obviously, fuel prices will go up significantly for aviation. Aviation, we're just starting to recover. They were just saying, look, we need a good summer to be able to kind of restore our balance sheets, and hopefully they will still have that, but they're now operating in a world where suddenly the cost of one of their major inputs is so much higher. So I think that's an industry. And I think equally thinking about agriculture and food production, I think food and drink manufacturers are probably an area that actually were quite hard hit during the pandemic and didn't have some of the direct grants that hospitality and other businesses did have. Those in the supply chain will be quite vulnerable. That said, I think though, actually balance sheets have weathered the COVID storm better than we anticipated. I think a year ago we were concerned we'd, at this stage start to see significant rises in insolvencies, that you'd really see pressure on businesses' cash flow. But actually, if you look across the whole economy as a whole, we've weathered it better than expected. And no one likes to speak too soon, because we know actually there are some variants of concern out there, and there's concern around COVID, particularly in Asia at the moment. So we haven't fully emerged, and what would, obviously we got another shock at the same time. But I think where the concerns now are some businesses that may have not been able to repair their balance sheets adequately. So it's more firm specific. But we're looking for those sectors that have been sort of hit by a double whammy. But at least I think we've learned, how to deal with crises within our own organisation and to have quite an agile response to that.
Yeah. Okay. Rain, let me stay with you, because I think I want to spend a little time just looking at two things: what businesses can do, and then I think what the Chancellor can do. But let's start with businesses. So, if you were to advise, as a small business, it must be tempting to think, look at the scale of this. This is enormous. Caroline saying there's a set of circumstances here we haven't seen, in any economic history we can find. But in light of that, what do you think are the practical measures that you could take as a small or medium-sized business to get through this as well as you can?
Well, as with always, I think cash is king. So looking at building up some of those cash reserves where it's possible. I think the other mistake that can happen is for businesses to retreat from some of their investment plans because things are difficult. And I think we did learn through the pandemic, if businesses can take a long-term view and continue to invest and be bold enough to do that, that yields benefits over the longer term. But of course, thinking as well about your exposure to Russia through your supply chains. And we do have an economic impact note on our website, and available more detail as well available to members. So do use all of that. I think the one thing I would say though, maybe a slight difference to what Caroline was saying, I think we are in a different stage in terms, I don't think this is as severe a shock as what we saw in the 70s. Then we saw inflation going above 20% in some cases. So I think this, while it's frightening now and the human cost is terrifying, but actually I think in some sense oil prices are coming back to where they were in 2014, and so it isn't so long ago that we've dealt with prices at this level, and I think that while inflation is going to go up, and I think it will settle at a higher level than maybe we've been used to, I think there are many things that are different about how our labour market operates, about how policy responds, that actually I think we will be more resilient, I think, than we were in the 70s. So I think it's also trying to put it in some of that perspective. We're not used to dealing with inflation in the last, of any significant kind in the last decade or two. So it's hard to get our heads around it, but I think it's still a different level of shock, but it does mean we need to double down on the resilience in our energy markets and that and investing in renewable energy. Absolutely.
And you're right, of course, Rain, there's high inflation, and but 10% does seem quite frightening to a lot of particularly younger people, I think. What tends to happen, given your sort of rallying cry, let's not forget investment, what tends to happen to investment in a relatively high inflation environment?
Well, it depends. I mean, a few things. I think uncertainty tends to be the biggest killer for investment, and a period of high inflation and more uncertain, people aren't really sure where inflation is going to settle. So I think that's the biggest challenge that businesses will be facing. But what matters most is those opportunities in terms of growth, and that's why more broadly we do need to get that focus on growth and productivity to find our way out of this crisis. The other thing is, of course, what happens to interest rates. And I think there, we know interest rates have gone up. They're likely to go up further this year. But I think one of the challenges that the policymakers at the Bank of England will face is, yes, we're going to see very high inflation in the near term, and they need to get ahead of that. They need to be clear that they are focused on containing inflation expectations. But at the same time, actually, the global growth prospects as a result of this, have got worse, right? So it's a shock to supply, but it's also a shock to demand, right? Because it will have a squeeze on household income. So actually, it's this challenging picture where we're seeing high inflation, but actually weaker growth. So that could mean that actually interest rates over the longer term settle at a lower level than we were expecting maybe back in January.
Okay, Rain, thanks. Carol, let me come to you, because this is not quite your day job, I appreciate, but if I parachuted you into a small business which is trying to think its way through how it might respond to what we're seeing all around us, sitting where you sit, looking at the commodities markets, how would you be thinking about that from the perspective of, from the vantage point of a small business?
I think I'd think about the inventories. Given the huge volatility in prices, and I think having had 10, 15 years of very low inflation, companies have become not so bothered about keeping stocks of things, because they can always go off and buy what they need at a reasonable price, or a price very similar to last year for immediate use. So I think and it's not my comfort zone, but if I was a business, I would think about boosting my inventories of raw materials that I need. Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily want to go off shopping today, given what's happened to high prices. But I think if you need it, you should probably, you will have to buy it. And there's also the risk that the price there's a very real risk the price could be higher in a couple of months' time. We haven't talked, well, we've touched on COVID, but currently large industrial cities in China are being closed down, into lockdown because of high COVID cases. And this is only going to add to what are already quite stretched supply chains, certainly if it's prolonged in any way, the lockdowns in China. So far, China's had this zero COVID policy, which requires these sort of lockdowns. So it'd be interesting to see over the next couple of months whether they persist with that. But worth flagging up another risk in the supply chain, really.
Yes, thanks, Caroline. Okay, Mark, let me come to you and at the same time turn to what the Chancellor can do. So you mentioned the need to sort of, we can't turn off oil and gas. We're not in that situation, but at the same time, we mustn't lose sight of the pivot to renewables. In that picture, and given the constraints now that there are going to be on his spending power, where do you see the sort of critical role for the Treasury and the Chancellor in what's to come?
So, just to draw back to the point, you're really about that, the sustained fiscal stability rather. It's about generating the investor confidence. It is fragile, as I say, over the last few years, and we've got to look to meet those, medium and long-term activities we outlined. We've got to be. It's important that we understand we need to deliver as much as we can with the homegrown industry. And that provides opportunities for us. We can support jobs, GDP, and we can limit the import as well as we look to the bigger. Importing is actually a bigger carbon footprint than locally sort of produced, and we've got to focus on that one. So our ask really is about supporting the sector, and make sure that it's underpinning the energy transition. As I say, we've got that journey to net zero. We've got the North Sea transition deal. We've got a limited window to be on the front foot, and we need to be joined up in our think and approach. We've really got an opportunity to really move and accelerate into the renewable space. We need the investment to do that, but we need to recognise also other countries are doing this. Other countries are having the same conversations as we're having right now. So that limited window exists, and the limited window, we've got a lot of attention, as I mentioned, around the North Sea transition deal, and a lot of interest from other areas of the world. So that generates where we are in terms of on that front foot, and we've got to maintain and to sustain that. As I go back to fiscal stability, will generate the level of investment, and I'll just go back to that figure, 16 billion. From an industry investment perspective from renewables, and just to stress, it really is oil and gas and renewables working in a balanced approach to give us that full energy mix. So yeah, really, I guess the ask would be around how do we generate fiscal stability. This week, the Prime Minister did sort of host a roundtable of UK oil and gas industry leaders, and sort of outlined that we will be working together to remove those barriers, facing investors and develop. So a positive sign there from the policymakers that should generate the investor confidence, and more to come, we hope, in this space.
Okay, and with your eyes clearly on that investor confidence target, what specific things, what specific measures do you think would help build that?
So one is around that positive communication, really getting into the data points as well, and the understanding. So that, understanding that there is a mixed opinion, of course, around oil and gas production and renewables, but it's understanding the balance equation to the delivery of it to meet the energy transition, and being able to support it with the data, support it with the facts that justify it. As I say, we simply cannot turn off oil and gas, even if we have wind and if we have solar as a backup. When we don't have wind and sun, we're going to need some form of supply system to it, some form of energy to supply us, so we can go through our energy demand there as well. So really, the message to support is around the positive messaging around what we are trying to achieve together to meet the requirements of the energy transition.
And Mark, this is going to be out of your comfort zone, so forgive me, but we are going to see a clamour, aren't we, for some support for households and small businesses who are facing potentially very significant energy price rises over the next, in April, and then possibly almost certainly again in October. Would your assessment be that how much room for manoeuvre does the Chancellor have there? Because the scale of what he's confronting is so huge now, isn't it? That is there a viable amount of support that could be put in place beyond the kind of measures we've seen already, the support for individual bill payers?
Again, yeah, that one is very much out with my comfort zone. So I'm afraid I feel that any answer I would sort of give there would be slightly probably misinformed. So I could always go back and sort of take it up afterwards. But yeah,
let me do what I always do when I'm in trouble and turn to Rain.
Yeah, very good question.
Yeah,
Rain, there's going to be a hue and cry, isn't there? People need help. The food prices are going up, as you said. Food and energy are the sort of they hit poorer households particularly hard. We're going to see this demand for something to be done. Is there something that can be done, do you think?
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think the easiest thing that the Chancellor could do is look at in next year. There is a planned increase in benefits to take into account higher inflation, and he could bring that forward. That's the best way to reach low income households, much more likely to be in receipt of benefits. So he could just bring forward that increase in benefits to this year, which would really help. It would cost about £9 billion. The Resolution Foundation presented some of the costings around that, but it could help to boost the income of those on the bottom 10% by about 5% overall. So would really help to, wouldn't account for all of the higher inflation we're seeing, but it would actually really help to smooth the impact on low income households. I think the other thing he does need to look at, as I said before, is helping SMEs in energy intensive industries. But I think to Mark's point is also looking at the network costs for some of our energy intensive industries and some of the exemptions that exist. We have an overall lower level of exemptions for some of the levy costs that energy intensive businesses face relative to some of our international competitors. And so I think that's something he could do, because even if you look at the measures he announced to help households with higher energy prices back in February, he was quite explicit. He was looking at the household and would come back to what it meant for businesses. And I think now is the time to come back to those, the pressures on businesses. And I think also to support what Mark was saying, we have to recognise in the UK Committee on Climate Change is very clear that oil and gas is part of our transition, certainly over the next decade. So we need gas as a transition fuel to eventually a net zero economy. So we need to keep that investment flowing. But more broadly, we know we need 50 billion pounds of investment in green technologies every year to meet our net zero transition, and that's up from a level of about 10 billion pounds. And the easiest thing the Chancellor can do is look at wider capital allowances and have a permanent deduction at 100% that follows on from the super deduction. That's one very clear way of getting more investment into the UK economy.
Rain, thank you so much. You're a star. The clock has defeated us, as it always does. So it's been fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. This is an enormous topic, and I think we're going to have to come back to it a number of times over the course of the next period. But Caroline, Mark, Rain, let me thank you all very much for your wisdom today. The next of these webinars is next Thursday, not Wednesday, and we're also, I think, going to be doing a spring statement debrief with you, Rain, off the back of the Chancellor's statement next week. Okay, thanks all, and we'll see you very soon. Bye for now.